Hello everybody, let's get started going through the examiner's report from the most recent exam. First of all, I just want to give you a bit of background to myself. My name's Aileen Edgar. I've been a tax tutor since 2008. I have previously worked for both ACCA and ICAS, and I now run my own tax teaching and content expert business, providing teaching, marking, tuition content, syllabus development, exam creation and review work to most of the professional accounting bodies in the UK, as well as a number of learning providers and universities. So I have supported thousands of students through their studies over the years, and today I'm going to be using that knowledge and experience to help you prepare for your March ATX exam. So in this session today, we're going to be unlocking the most recent examiner's report, looking at how you can avoid some of the common mistakes that the exam team saw at that sitting. I'm going to run through some of the highlights from the examiner's report first of all, and then give you some of my top tips for avoiding some of these mistakes in your exam in March. And then we'll have time for your questions at the end. Now, please don't feel that you need to wait until the very end to ask your question. As Hazel explained, there's a Q&A box that you can pop your question into. So please do that as we go through the session, and I'll pick up on those questions at the end.
Before we start looking at the examiner's report, I just thought it'd be useful to remind you of the format of this exam. There are 100 marks in total, 80 of which are technical marks and 20 of which are professional marks. There are 3 questions, all of which are compulsory. Question 1 is 50 marks, which is broken down into 40 technical marks and 10 professional marks. Included as part of the 40 technical marks will be 5 marks for ethics. And in questions 2 and 3, there are 25 marks, 20 of these being technical and 5 being for professional skills. Time allocations then, you should look to spend around 90 minutes on question 1 and 45 minutes on each of the other 2 questions. Now, one of the first things that is mentioned in the most recent examiner's report is to show your workings in the exam. Do not just show a final answer. You must show your marker that you have applied the correct methods to arrive at the answer. Please don't worry about being perfect. If you make a mistake somewhere in your calculation, but then use that incorrect number in the correct way later on, or to give certain advice for your client, then the marker will only penalise you once for an error and will give you as much credit as they can for using that incorrect number in later work. Some of the general tips and advice contained within the examiner's report are to make sure that you have covered the full ATX syllabus, which includes the brought forward knowledge from the TX syllabus, because all of that is examinable as well. And interestingly, the examiner has used the word precise when talking about this knowledge. In the ATX exam, we want to see you being as precise as possible. Think about a real work situation where you have a client who has come and asked you for some advice on a tax bill. There's no use in telling the client some vague information around tax rules. That client needs to know, for example, exactly how much tax they might have to pay and when exactly it's due. And if they don't pay it, what are the consequences? You couldn't just tell them that they will have some tax to pay sometime next year. There's a danger then that your client is late paying tax or doesn't pay enough and ends up being hit with penalties or interest payments, and you can imagine they wouldn't be too happy about that. That leads us on to another point the examiner makes about applying your knowledge to the specific scenario in the question, in that you need to make sure that you're focusing on the points that are most relevant and not wasting time on irrelevant, albeit accurate information. The examiner points out as well that you must make sure you are attempting every requirement. If you don't put an answer for every requirement, you are making it much tougher to pass. And the examiner also emphasises the importance of spending more time thinking and planning your answers. And that then leads us on to thinking about managing your time. You must make sure that you're managing your time throughout the exam in order to make sure that you're able to attempt every requirement, and also making sure that you are addressing all the elements that are being asked for within a requirement as well. Running out of time in the exam for the last question that you attempt is an all too common reason why students fail this exam. So you need to make sure that you are practicing some questions under timed conditions to work on your exam technique in this area. The examiner's report also gives some specific advice for resitters, particularly telling you to identify your weak areas from your previous sitting of the exam. Make sure that you're practicing past papers and also think back to your time management in the exam and where you can make some improvements. Now, let's look at some technical examples from the most recent exam. I've picked out a few of the trickier parts to discuss, starting with question 1, part C, which was for 13 marks and focused on CGT and inheritance tax on the gift of shares and their subsequent sale. We're going to look at this requirement in more detail, bringing in some of the examiner's points on this question, along with explaining how to approach your answer in an effective manner. So in this requirement, we had an individual, Jake, who was considering selling the whole of his shareholding in Paul Limited. And this, therefore, was 6,000 shares. He's looking at selling this in 24.25 at a market value of £470,000. The company is an unquoted trading company, and we're told that Jake has never been an employee and nor will he be in the future. He was gifted these 6,000 shares by his aunt on the 1st of October 2021 when they were worth £420,000. She had bought them for £295,000 on the 1st of May 2015. Jake and his aunt made a joint election for gift holdover relief in October 2021, and they deferred £112,500 of the gain. We're told the gift qualified for 100% business property relief, and that 12% of Paul Limited's total assets are classified as accepted assets. On the 1st of September 2021, the aunt had gifted Jake's sister an investment property worth £360,000. And we're told to assume the aunt dies between the 1st of January 2024 and the 31st of December 2026, and that is therefore within 7 years of the gift to Jake. There was a lot to do in this requirement, so I've summarised the main elements here. Explain with no calculations Jake's potential liability to IHT at the time of the sale of the shares and on the subsequent death of his aunt. Calculate the chargeable gain resulting from the sale before the deduction of any available reliefs, and explain whether or not business asset disposal relief and/or rollover relief would be available. And explain the relief which would be available in respect of any inheritance tax payable following the death of Jake's aunt. Now, this requires a good amount of planning before starting your answer. There are 3 separate elements of this question, and even within some of those, there are different tasks to complete. So careful planning and structuring of your answer will really make a difference. Now, many students would look at these requirements and highlight words such as IHT, shares, reliefs, but you'll see that I highlight very different words. My focus is more on the how, not the what. You need to first understand the how of your answer before you can apply the knowledge from your head to the answer. You need to think about whether you're going to be using the spreadsheet answer space or the word processing answer space or a combination of the two. And looking carefully at the wording of the requirements can help give you a structure for your answer as well. For example, in the first part, we have to explain the IHT liability at 2 different points in time. So we could put 2 headings on our answer to make sure that we cover both parts, the sale of the shares and also when the ant dies. So here is how I would set out my structure for the first part of this requirement while I'm doing my planning. I would have one heading for the explanation around the potential liability to IHT at the time of the sale of the shares, and another heading for the subsequent death of the ant. This is a really helpful way of making sure that you don't forget any part of the requirement, as you'll notice if you've got a blank space under one of these headings. I know I don't need to do any calculations, so I would likely be using the word processing answer space here. The first part around the sale of the shares is fairly straightforward because there aren't any inheritance tax implications. And that's because the shares are intended to be sold at full market value. Therefore, there's not going to be any impact on inheritance tax because Jake's wealth is not going to decrease as a result of their sale. He is swapping shares for cash of the same value. So his wealth, his estate, doesn't decrease in value at all. So there's no inheritance tax impact there. Where the majority of the marks are for this part, though, is around the potential impacts of the death of the ant. Now, we were told in the question that Jake is intending to sell the shares in tax year 24-25 and to consider the possibility that the ant dies between the 1st of January 2024 and the 31st of December 2026. We were also told that the shares qualified for BPR at the time of the gift. If the ant was to die within 7 years of the gift of the shares, this will be a failed, potentially exempt transfer. At the time of the gift, 100% BPR applied. If Jake still owns the shares when the ant dies, 100% BPR will apply again, but this will be restricted by the 12% accepted assets we were told about in the scenario. The remainder would be taxed at the death tax rate of 40%. If Jake doesn't still own the shares when the ant dies, BPR won't be available, and so the full gift value of £420,000 is going to be subject to inheritance tax, again at the death tax rate of 40%. There are no annual exemptions or a nil rate band available, as these will have been used up by the gift to the sister that was made earlier in the same tax year. Taper relief could apply though if the ant dies more than 3 years after the gift of the shares. Now you can see we haven't used any calculations as instructed, but we have worked our way down the inheritance tax computation that you would have done in that we first considered BPR, then exemptions and the nil rate band and previous gifts made, then the tax rate and then taper relief. So that helped to give a structure to our answer and achieve a good amount of depth. Here is an outline for the second part of this requirement on the chargeable gain computation and applicable CGT reliefs. Each part of the task has been split out into subheadings to ensure that nothing is missed. The first part here asks for a calculation of the chargeable gain from the sale before reliefs. This was a fairly straightforward computation, which the examiner noted most students were able to do well. With the second part here about explaining whether or not BADR and/or rollover relief would be available, you can see that we've made 2 statements about whether it is or is not available for each relief asked for, and we've given a reason why, and that is what makes the difference between a statement and an explanation, is that level of detail to support our conclusion. Notice how we haven't listed off all the conditions for each relief, but instead focused on the ones that would prevent this relief from applying. That is giving an ATX standard of answer, focusing in on the specifics of our scenario. It's interesting to note that in the examiner's report, it flags up that many students were comfortable with the BADR point, but missed that rollover relief is not available in shares. This is a common mistake we see students making, so ensure you don't fall into the same trap. The third part was to explain the relief which would be available in respect of any inheritance tax payable following the death of Jake's aunt. This was a tricky part here, as highlighted in the examiner's report. Only a very small amount of students knew that any inheritance tax payable could actually be deducted from the chargeable gain because gift holdover relief had been claimed on the gift of the shares by the aunt to Jake. This was the type of point that you either know in the exam or you don't. And if you're struggling with something like this in your exam, make sure to consider how many marks you think it's worth and move on to another part where you do have the relevant knowledge. As much as it is important to write something for every requirement, there may well be parts of certain requirements that you just can't think of an answer for. Go and get the mark somewhere else where you're stronger. Question 2 of the December paper was about a group of companies, including the transfer of a freehold factory, trading losses and then rollover relief, capital allowances and the savings of corporation tax there could be as a result of certain capital purchases. We're going to look at part B1 here in more detail. Now, this isn't necessarily the most challenging topic area for students, but I do think it throws up some useful things for us to reflect on and that you can learn from. The requirement was to explain the maximum possible amount of Rabo Limited's trading loss for the year ended 31 December 23, which can be transferred to Murada Limited. We're told that both companies have got a 31st December 2023 year end. Rabo Limited has a trading loss of $72,000 and it can't use it in earlier years. The company expects to make a £30,000 trading profit next year though, and Murada Limited has a trading profit of £840,000 and property income of £43,000. We're told that on the 31st of October 2023, Murada Limited entered into an arrangement to sell all of the ordinary shares of Rabo Limited to an unconnected individual who plans to make some significant changes to the company's operations. Now note a couple of things from the requirement. We have the command word explain there. This is suggesting a narrative answer. But then we're asked for the maximum amount. So that must mean there's some sort of calculation or working with numbers to do as well. But it would suggest that the focus should be on explanations for the marks. You should not just be jumping to the amount without explaining why that's the correct figure. And then to the solution. Now, I've mocked up here a couple of possible answers to this requirement to show you how to take a weaker answer and then turn it into a stronger one with a few changes. The examiner noted in their report that some students missed out on relatively easy marks by not setting out that the maximum amount would be the lower of 10/12 of Murada's TTP and 10/12 of Rabo's trading loss. So it's useful to note then that even if you come to the right conclusion, as the answer here on the left does, you won't necessarily pick up all of the available marks because you haven't convinced the marker that you really understand the rules and how they apply in this particular situation. Another point to note from the difference between the weaker answer on the left and the stronger answer on the right is that the weaker answer just talks in a very generic way around the relevant rules, but the stronger answer pulls in key facts from the scenario and applies those to the rules. For example, both of these answers have identified that there is a 75% group relief group in place, but the stronger answer actually uses the names of the companies that are involved. So make sure you're always pulling in relevant figures, names or dates from the scenario in order to help you tailor your answer to the specific question. And you can see then, by doing that, the candidate on the right has been able to get more depth to their answer and pick up more points. Question 3 of the paper was split into 3 parts. The first looking at residency tests, specifically the sufficient ties tests for 5 marks, then looking at CGT on a property for 7 marks, which included some reliefs, and the third part for 8 marks was a property income calculation, which included some double tax relief. We are going to look at part C in this session because although the examiner noted that a lot of students did well overall with this requirement, one area that was noted as a real weakness within their answers was the application of double tax relief. So here is the relevant information for this part. Pinto is UK domiciled, was UK resident until 21-22 and then again from tax year 23-24, acquired a house in Vicia on the 1st of June 2022 and that house will be rented out from the 1st of May 2024. In tax year 24-25, Pinto will receive £8,375 of rental income from this overseas property after allowable expenses but before the deduction of Vician tax. The tax rate in the overseas country is 16% for property income. There is no double tax treaty with that country, and we're told that Pinto's other income consists of employment income of £10,000 and dividends of £2,500. As Pinto is UK domiciled and resident in the tax year that we're being asked about, which is tax year 24-25, we're looking at someone who's going to be taxed under UK income tax rules on the rental income from this overseas property, as well as suffering tax of 16% in that country. As there's no double tax treaty in place between the UK and the overseas country, they will need to apply unilateral tax relief in the computation. This is also known as double tax relief, DTR. So how do we approach this then? It's only asking us to calculate, so no explanations are needed, but we do need to think about how we should approach and plan out our answer. We need to work out the property income figure after all taxes have been deducted. Note the use of the plural there, taxes rather than tax. That is a clue that there is likely to be more than one tax amount to deduct. We've set out the answer here in 2 columns, one that includes overseas income and one that doesn't. Why would we do that? Because we have to work out how much UK tax is just on that specific bit of income, the overseas property income. This is the specific bit that the examiner states students struggled with the most in this requirement. Now you might be thinking, couldn't we just do 20% multiplied by the 8375 as this person is a basic rate taxpayer? Well, in this particular question that wouldn't work because the person hasn't used up their full personal allowance against other non-savings income. So there is still some of that 12,570 that would be applied against this overseas property income. So instead, we set out the 2 columns, one which has the overseas property income in it, and one that doesn't. And we do an income tax computation for each then, and then compare the difference in income tax. Now you can see that the UK income tax due if the overseas income is not present is 0 versus 1205 if it is present. And let's look at the DTR computation then in a bit more detail, because that's the bit that students found more difficult. We want the lower of the overseas tax suffered and the UK tax on the overseas income. So the overseas tax figure is the overseas tax rate of 16% multiplied by the overseas income of 8375 to get £1,340. And the UK tax on that overseas income is the difference between the tax liability in our two columns. So that's the 1,205 less the 0. So 1205 is the answer to that part. The lower of those two figures then is 1205, and that is the double tax relief that can be applied in our income tax computation, and that will bring our actual liability down to 0. Now don't forget to check the requirement again after a big bit of computational work like this. And you can see that if you're actually answering what has been asked, they ask for the property income figure after all taxes. So that would be the property income figure of 8375 less UK income tax of 0 and less the overseas tax of £1,340. That comes to a final answer of 7035. And this part was a crucial last step that some students missed out due to not going back and reading the requirement carefully. Now, you would have been able to pick up lots of marks even if you did struggle with the double tax relief part, or if you missed out that last final after taxes figure. And many of those marks would have come from assumed knowledge from the TX syllabus on an income tax computation. So don't give up even if you think you're making mistakes or you don't fully understand what to do. There are easier marks and harder marks. Make sure you are getting the easier ones in each requirement at least. So what can we learn from reviewing this question alongside the examiner's report? Firstly, remember you've got access to tax tables in the exam. You'll find a link to them in the bottom left-hand corner of the screen in your exam. Start using them to help you answer questions if you haven't already been doing so. You'll discover what things you have to commit to memory and what things you'll be able to just refer to in the tables in your exam. In question 3 in this paper, the examiner noted that students sometimes struggled with the application of the sufficient ties tests in part A, and actually there was some useful information available to them in the tax tables had they looked at it. Students in part A of question 3 were noted as not always giving specific enough answers. The examiner noted that some just stated the sufficient ties tests without relating them specifically to the client in this question and whether they were therefore classed as UK resident or not as a result. In part B of question 3, there were marks for identifying and applying private residence relief. The examiner notes in the report that reliefs across all taxes is a very important part of the ATX syllabus, and students should be prepared for these to be regularly tested in every exam. And in part C of question 3, the examiner noted that students should make sure to spend more time reading the requirements more carefully, as some students missed the fact that this requirement only asks them to calculate, so no marks would be available for explanations. Students spending time writing explanations were just wasting time for no extra marks. So I have summarised the most recent examiner's report for you here. But there is a lot more detail in there, so I recommend after this session, if you haven't already, make sure you go and read the detail, making your own notes and highlighting areas that you could improve on before March. And I would also recommend you go further back and read at least 2 or 3 more reports, because that way you start to spot patterns in where students can go wrong in the exam, and you'll also see a variety of different topics, ideas and styles of question being discussed by the examiner. Where possible, you should review the examiner's report alongside the past paper questions and marking guide on the practice platform. I hope that you have found that run through of the December's examiner's report helpful, and that it gives you confidence in how to use these reports effectively in preparation for your March exam. I just wanted to cover now a few of the practical tips that you can implement during your exam in order to maximise your chances of passing. Firstly, let's think about when you're reading the requirement and thinking about starting to answer a question. I want you to get into the habit of pausing and planning. Take a minute or two to look at that requirement carefully. Don't just see a requirement and pull out of it the topic area. This is something I see so many students do. They are scanning the requirements, trying to understand which topic area is being asked about, for example. Is it a question about the use of trading losses, or is it a question about VAT registration? What is actually going to be more beneficial for you to do is spend time looking at the way the question has been structured. How many marks is it worth? How many points do you think you have to write? Should you be using the spreadsheet answer space or the word processing answer space, or indeed a combination of both? What command words are being used? Are you being asked to purely calculate something? Or are you being asked to compare different approaches? All of these aspects are crucial for you to understand before you start writing your answer. When you start answering that question, you'll cover the fact that it's a question about VAT registration or a question about trading losses. But if you don't pause and plan and take notice of how many marks it's worth, or what format you should structure your answer in, or how many different parts you're meant to address in your answer, then you may not give an answer that matches up with the marking scheme. You may waste time for no marks. You may veer off on a tangent. You may not write enough. Having the knowledge of the technical topics being asked about is just half the battle. You must have good exam technique as well to pass this exam. Pausing and planning before every requirement answer is an excellent habit to get into. Now, linked to that is the trap that some students fall into, which is just writing everything they know on a topic rather than tailoring their answers specifically to the client in the question. The ATX exam requires you to apply your knowledge very specifically and not be giving general cookie cutter style answers which could apply to any client that you're dealing with. So again, taking time to plan and think before you start answering a question allows you to consider what parts of the knowledge you have on the topic area that are relevant to be discussed. I'll give you an example from the December exam. Question 2, Part A, asks students to explain how the base cost of the factory in the question was to be calculated. A generic answer here would have discussed that because there was a transfer between two companies in a chargeable gains group, that they would find the base cost by using the original cost to the transferor company. However, this particular scenario made mention of a plan for the recipient company to leave the group within 6 years of the transfer, and so the base cost of the asset, when the degrouping charge is triggered, would actually be the market value at the time of the no gain, no loss transfer between the companies in the group. So students had to make use of this specific information in the scenario to work through their knowledge and pull out the relevant pieces only. One of my absolute top tips in the exam is to read the requirement one more time before you move on. At ATX, so often, we'll have a requirement that has a couple of different elements to it. And if you go back and read it one more time before you move on to the next question, you may well just spot where you've been asked to provide a date or provide after-tax proceeds figure, for example. These final little pieces of a question may not be worth a lot of marks, but it could make the difference between a pass and a fail. Indeed, we saw this in question 1B in the December paper, where students were asked to calculate the post-tax proceeds, but the examiner's report noted that some students were working out the gain less deductions rather than the proceeds figure less deductions. So reading that requirement one more time when you think you've answered everything might just help you spot that you have misread something in the requirement or you've missed something out altogether. And my last top tip is around time management. So many capable students find themselves struggling in the real exam with their time management, and poor planning and control of time in an exam situation can prevent students from being able to show the marker exactly what they're made of, because they simply run out of time to do so. So how can you make sure that you don't fall into that trap?
You need to be super strict with yourself in that exam. I promise you that the marker will not think badly of you if you haven't finished a calculation in full. With ATX, particularly with calculation requirements, students always feel they must get to the final number of a calculation, but there are actually marks all over the calculation, and the final number sometimes doesn't have a mark attached to it. So please keep an eye on your time, and when the allocated amount for the requirement or question you're doing is done, you must move on. You can make use of the flag function within the exam to flag up that you need to come back to that question if you find yourself with some spare time at the end. But if you don't make any attempt at a particular requirement, you'll definitely get 0 for that requirement. But if you can make 1 or 2 points, then you can be hopeful that you're at least going to get some marks for your effort.
We are going to move on for the last 5 to 10 minutes, just going through questions that have been coming in via the Q&A area. If you haven't yet asked a question and you really want to, please make sure you pop it in as quickly as you can. I'm going to just work with the first ones that came in and work my way up to the most recent questions. I'll try and cover as many as I possibly can in the time that we've got left. Areas that you need to look out for in March in terms of syllabus areas, I'm presuming. Well, we always know that there's going to be 5 ethics marks. There will definitely be 5 ethics marks in question 1 in the exam, and that is something that you can definitely prepare for ahead of time. There are a number of common scenarios that can come up in ethics. Sometimes there's a little bit of a twist in the exam question, but if you've covered topics like taking on a new client, dealing with an error, conflicts of interest, if you've covered those plus a few others, you'll have a good solid base for ethics. Now, in terms of the other topics, well, absolutely anything in the ATX syllabus and the TX syllabus is examinable. So you can't question spot for this exam. But we do see common themes coming through on a regular basis. Overseas issues, reliefs, particularly, capital gains reliefs, inheritance tax reliefs, capital gains tax and inheritance tax being applicable to the same scenario, losses, an unincorporated business. These are not the only things that can come up, but these are things that come through on a regular basis, certainly. So you want to make sure you're solid on that, but also very much that you've got a good basis of your TX knowledge on which to build the new ATX knowledge. Okay. I'm just looking at the ones that I can pick up. Some of these questions are more ACCA questions. Okay. Now, there was a question. Oh, sorry. You're going to say something?
I was just going to say there are some in the folder on the left with your name.
Oh.
On the top.
Oh, I see it. Thank you.
You've picked out some lovely questions from the students for you.
Lovely. How nice. Thank you very much. Because there's lots of great questions coming in. Thank you. Okay, so we've got, oh yes, a great question about being exempt from TX. Will you have covered everything just by studying for ATX? Well, it depends how you're studying. If you're using an approved learning provider to help support you, they'll be covering off assumed knowledge. You can also make use of the ACCA Study Hub. You can go into the TX section of that as well as the ATX section, and you can see lots of quizzes, flashcards, and notes as well, just covering off the TX syllabus. So, but what I would recommend for that is that you spend your time, your focus on ATX past paper practice, and identify from that the areas that you need to go back and do a little bit more of a refresher on from the assumed knowledge. That would be the best use of your time at this stage. Okay, will you lose marks for using word processor for calculations rather than Excel? You won't lose marks, no. There may be, if it's question 1, there may be a chance that you won't pick up one of the professional marks for providing your answer in the asked for format. Perhaps, I say. that's not guaranteed. There is a table function within the word processing answer space. So if it's not a massive calculation, you could make use of creating a little table. That can look quite neat, I think. But I would say that if the requirement does say calculate, you should be jumping over and using the spreadsheet answer space. Do just make sure that you flag up in your word processing answer space, say something like see spreadsheet, so your marker knows to go and find it. Make sure you're using headings for the requirements so they can follow that clearly. Great question. Examiner's answer is more detailed. If you write the answer in a short way, would you still get full marks? Great question. So what you need to remember about seeing examiner's answers or some of the model answers perhaps in some of the resources you might have access to is that a lot of the time that's also there as a teaching aid to help somebody who's self-studying, to help somebody who's reviewing it to figure out where they've gone wrong and why certain numbers are being used or why certain reliefs don't apply. So it's not that you necessarily have to write the same level of detail, definitely not as that. So yes, don't worry about writing as much detail as you might see sometimes. Professional marks, very hard. How can you easily get them? You should not be focusing on picking up professional marks. If you're answering the question that has been asked in the exam in the way it has been asked, you will pick up professional marks hand in hand. Sometimes it's about the fact you spotted a particular relief applies that's not been made obvious. Sometimes it's because you've spotted that maybe some tax advice that's been given in the question, that doesn't sound like it's fully correct and you've been asked to give some advice on that. There might be a skepticism mark there. So if you're answering the question that has been asked and you're focusing on your technical marks, the professional marks should come hand in hand with that. Just checking, some of these are similar questions. Just pick another one or two. Somebody was asking about the difference between the strong answer and weak answer that I gave you an example of. Yes, the weak answer would still definitely pick up marks. The way that I wrote it, they would definitely still have picked up marks, but they just wouldn't have been able to get full marks because they just weren't extending their answer. They weren't being specific enough in their answer. Perfect. I think... how many past paper, right, last one, how many past paper questions is enough for a pass? I always say it's about quality rather than quantity. Make sure you're spending a good amount of time reviewing your answer and noting down any areas of weakness and go and revise those. So I think we've covered off most of the themes that came through in those questions. Thank you so much.